Hi, everybody. Welcome to History Happy Hour. Chris Anderson was just with me. He's going to be back in a minute. He's got to dial in again because we were having a little technical problem. But welcome to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Tours, offering a variety of history tours in Europe, the U.S., and the Pacific. You can check it out at StephenAmbroseTours.com. And let me just say, whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening to the HHH podcast, thank you for joining us. And today we'll be talking about the 6.888 Postal Battalion, the predominantly African American battalion, all women who served in World War II, and quite a story, and we're going to get into that today. So let us know that you're here and what you're drinking. And if you, as you're tuning in, I promise Chris has not bailed on the show. He is just dialing back in. And he'll be joining us in a minute so that we can find out where he is and what he is doing today. And while we're waiting for Chris, let me just say that we want to thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, especially our top shelf patrons. And you can help keep the History Taps running by becoming a Patreon of History Happy Hour on patreon.com/History Happy Hour. Chris Anderson,
What have I
welcome.
been missing?
Welcome. I just assumed that the show is now mine to do what I wanted with, and so
You were going mad?
I was going mad with power and glory. It was fantastic.
Was it?
there's
I
a-
can make it. I can.
no. Stick with. Well, I'm willing to deal with this, slightly diminished reality of, of having you there. I saw your post. You've been off at doing air shows and such. Are you on vacation? Are you on tour? What's going on?
No. So yeah, well, we finished up Poland, and I was in Berlin, for a couple of days doing some site inspection work, and then I flew from Berlin back home to London, and went right to Cambridge to catch the Battle of Britain air show. So I'm helping our friend Hugh McDonald Buchanan finish up the Battle of Britain tour. So.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, and I just got back from being on the Ghost Army tour and the Ghost Army Post tour. And as I know, we have at least one person who did my tour, who's on your tour now. And I'm leaving Tuesday for Quebec to do some site inspections. And then on Saturday, head to Boston to start the Boston to Quebec American Revolution tour. This is the first time we're actually going to do it, Boston to Quebec. Yeah, the last time we did Boston, get up right close to the Canadian border, then veer south because Canada wouldn't let us in.
Is it going to turn out differently this time?
The war, I think, might, because it's happening in a different order than it did last time. So certain battles come in front of other battles, etc. But Chris, we are. I got away some of the kind of the all the stuff that I have to talk about. So stuff is done. So we've probably killed enough time that we can get into this. If you want to give us a cue, we can try to get started.
All right. Oh, that's so good to hear.
Oh, yes, the bell is back. The bell is back. And the history taps are open. The 6.888
Yes.
Postal Battalion. They were the only predominantly all-black U.S. Women's Army units sent overseas during World War II. And they're kind of having a moment. There's a movie in production directed by Tyler Perry. There's a Broadway-bound musical. They have been awarded a Congressional Gold Medal. So it seems like it's time to give them the ultimate honor of having an hour of History Happy Hour devoted to them. And our guest today is Edna Cummings. And Edna is a retired colonel in the U.S. Army who spent 25 years in the Army. She championed the successful effort to convince Congress to award a Congressional Gold Medal to the 6.888 and served as a producer for a documentary titled The 6.888. She's also a consultant on the Broadway musical. Edna Cummings, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Hi, thank you for having me.
We are so delighted, and that is an awesome pink outfit that you've got on.
She raises the bar there, Rick.
Yeah, it really does.
Oh yeah, happy. Happy hour.
So Edna, to start out, for people who might be tuning in who are new to this story, give us the nutshell. What was the 6.888, and why are they getting so much attention now?
Wow. Well, You started off very well. The 688 was an all black battalion, 855 women. They were all black, but they were not all African American. From the Women's Army Corps, because during World War II, there were more than 7,000 African American women and women of color who served, including nurses. And about 13%, 855, were tasked to go overseas to solve the Army's male problem. And it's actually the military's male problem. The Army was just in charge. And so the 688, without any extensive training in postal operations in February 1945, cleared a massive mail backlog, 2 to 3 years, and half the time the Army thought they would clear it. About 17 million pieces of mail in about 90 days in Birmingham, England, and went on to Rouen and Paris, France. And they restored vital communications to the troops and the Americans stationed in the European theater of operations. And they improved troop morale because the war wasn't over until September 1945, until D-Day, preparations for D-Day, the battles after D-Day caused a massive mail backlog. And the Army said, hey, we have a problem. If we don't get this mail flowing, troop morale is going to plummet. And ultimately, when the troops aren't happy, it's hard to motivate them to continue to fight.
So, but how did the idea of forming this battalion come about? Maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of the origins. I know it's set up in 1943, and it's new, and what's the impetus to create this unit?
Right. Well, the unit, as I mentioned, was created in 1944 because when the U.S. got involved in the war post D-Day, units of white women were going overseas to serve. And at the time, it was only the Women's Army Corps, and the Air Force was part of the Women's Army Corps at the time, or the part of the Army. But it was hard to get to convince the War Department to send Black women overseas.
Mm.
A lot of the Black troops in general being relegated to menial tasks. And so with women, women were in support of the men going to war. You know, women were not allowed to fight on the front lines, but they were still doing meaningful work. So the push by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune was the impetus to get Black women involved in the overseas effort. And what was interesting when Black women joined the Army in 1942, actually, that's when the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was formed without benefits. 1943, the Women's Army Corps was formed with benefits. But the percentage of Black women was limited to 10%. It was a racial quota because I had to have parity with the African Americans or the Black population in the US. So that was the first hurdle to get,
Right.
and then to convince theater commanders that African American women could serve overseas because this was a military segregated by race and gender. So in the middle of a war, you have to accommodate women, you have to accommodate segregation. So it imposed a logistical effort for theater commanders as well as just the notion of what can Black women do to make a meaningful contribution to the war effort. But Dr. Mabel Cloud Bethune and First Lady Roosevelt convinced the War Department to send Black women overseas.
Well, one of the things that we're familiar with is the Double Victory campaign. Let's fight the Axis abroad, fight racism at home. There's a big push to get African American men sent overseas. Push to do the Tuskegee Airmen. There's a Black paratroop outfit that's formed towards the end of the war. Is there a similar? You mentioned a couple of people, but is there a similar advocacy effort for African American women? Is it a kind of a smaller effort, or is there a similar kind of push to get these guys really involved in the war effort?
Right. Well, the African American women or the Black women were involved as part of the Double Victory campaign, Double V, but I like to call it a Triple Victory campaign because, we're women, African American, and so those three challenges that the Army or the military at the time were grappling with. So, in terms of the black press, that's a good segue because the Pittsburgh Courier started the Double Victory campaign, but the Afro American newspaper actually sent 7 war correspondents abroad, and one of the publisher's daughter, called J. Murphy, his daughter was in the 688. So, in terms of a push, the Afro publisher ensured that the 688 stories received quite a bit of a coverage. And her name was Vashti Murphy Matthews, and she actually wrote articles while she was overseas for the Afro American newspaper. So even though the push did not have a name of its own, it was a subset of the Double Victory campaign, an effort to get the black women overseas.
Right. So, so when they were formed, were they were they formed? Was this unit formed specifically for them, or were these African American women? You know, they fight to get into the army. They become members of the Women's Army Corps, and then the unit is created from that, or is this
Yes.
kind of set up for them?
Right. The unit was created from women who were in the Women's Army Corps, and some women also volunteered because in mid 44, there was a huge recruiting effort for Black women to serve overseas. But the mission was unknown. Even the commander who was eventually selected had no idea what the mission was. So the women were recruited to go overseas, and it was drawn from the Army Air Corps, the 688 drawn from the Army Air Corps, the Army Armed Forces, and the existing women in the Women's Army Corps. So it was just an effort for women to go overseas. They had to, first of all, meet the entry requirements. All women, regardless of race, had to have high school diplomas. So the men didn't have to have high school diplomas. So you think about the literacy levels during post-depression in World War II, pretty low. I think only 30%, a little bit more than 30% of U.S., of Americans had high school diplomas. So the 688, all of the women had high school diplomas. And then I read where about 85% were ex-school teachers or college graduates. And so about 85%. So you had the best of the nation, academically and just in terms of meeting the requirements, because these women had to undergo psychological testing and other training to ensure they could, number one, be okay with serving abroad, because most of these women have never left their cities, let
Yeah.
alone going overseas. So it was a deliberate effort to get women to serve overseas, but the mission was unknown.
So that's really fascinating. So
Hmm.
we're forming this unit, and I don't know when they gave it the number or the name,
Right.
but they're forming a unit. We're going to send you overseas, but we don't know what you're going to do.
Right. Well, the military knew, the women didn't do and didn't know. And it was interesting. The commander, Charity Adams, said that in her book, One Woman's Army, when she was assigned to go overseas, she was given an envelope and was told, all right, she got her orders to go overseas. Do not open this until maybe about an hour because it was marked secret. So she had no idea where she was going until she got midair en route to Europe, to the European Theater of Operations. And speaking with some of the women who were still alive from the 688, they didn't know where they were going either. It was blind faith. They knew they were going to the European Theater, but they didn't find out about the mission. I think one said about midway through, they knew they were going to work in a postal unit. So the unit initially, the name was 5103C. It was a training unit that was just a designator, and it became the 688 in March because, again, thanks to Charity Adams' book, she wrote orders appointing herself as the commander. The undersigned hereby appoints, the above named individual as commander, the unit. It took time. Once the unit was formed, it was in a training status. And then for the Army's heraldry department, whoever signs the unit, designators to assign the unit as a 688. So they get over there, just warehouses and airplane hangars full of packages and mail that they estimate little over 2 years, because you think of the D-Day preparations and the time before D-Day. And as the World War II historians, even though June 6th was D-Day, the preparations started before D-Day. And one piece of information that can tip off the adversary is an address. And so mail had to be censored, it had to be stopped for a while. And I read in January of 1945, this port company, it was a black port unit who was in one of the waves at Normandy, offloaded 130,000 bags of mail in France alone. So the area where the 688 worked was in Birmingham, England, in a large part of a larger postal network for the U.S.
Chris, or is it you?
No, well, it's me, but you cut me
Yeah.
out there. So, what was obviously they're kind of going into this situation sort of blind. They arrive in England. What's the reaction of the Army and the ATO? I mean, are they aware that this unit's coming and what they're going to do? Or
Yeah, they're aware the unit was coming, but
Are they incredibly welcoming to the?
well, the locals were. The
Right.
locals were. But for the 688, 855 women, they were self-sustaining. They had to set up a mini military installation to take care of themselves because they were segregated by race and gender. So the women had to repair their own vehicles, cook their own food, and just think about setting up a garrison or a mini military installation in Birmingham, England. So, welcoming from the Army, there were articles of war that prohibited discussions about race because that could easily be turned to propaganda. And as we know, that was part of the propaganda machine for the Axis powers. So, but 855 women, you have a 26-year-old commander, by the way, Charity Adams. She was only 26 years old, and she was a battalion commander. Battalion commanders now are a lot older than 26. Most have been in the Army, I don't know, 15 years, minimum 15, 16 years. She'd been in the Army since 1942. She was with that first class of women who went through the training at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, for the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. So there were 40 slots for African American, 440 women in the first class of officers, 40 slots for African Americans, 36, I believe, graduated. And Charity Adams, because of her name, was the first African American woman to receive her commission as an officer in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. So she had troop experience. And so one question I get was, well, how could she figure it out? I respond by saying I think she was probably a genius. She was in graduate school at Ohio State in vocational psychology. When she joined the Army, and undergraduate at Wilberforce, she majored in math, Latin, and physics. She was a triple major.
well,
So
as you do.
Yeah.
yeah. So this woman was brilliant. So I think she was a systems engineer without knowing it. She got in, all right, we have to task organize. She looked at with her staff, they looked at all the women, figured out who could do what, who could set up a hair salon, who could work on the vehicles, who could manage the dining facilities. Because these women coming from the Army had, a set of skills that they had already. So she just task organized to figured out a way to increase throughput. And that throughput was 65,000 pieces of mail and packages per shift, around the clock operations for 90 days straight. And that's the roughly 17 million pieces of mail and packages. Of course, 65,000 pieces of mail, that's at peak operations, and you have fluctuations. But based on the backlog and the information I found, about the port company offloading, they broke records for offloading 130,000 bags of mail in January. It's plausible that that 5 million pieces of mail and packages per month was about right for their throughput in 90 days. And the Army thought it would take 6 months if they could do it at all, because other units had tried and failed. That postal network had been set up since the Americans arrived in the European theater, and that was the hub of postal operations. So you had the locals, you had Americans, and then you had, other units of wax to come over and try to sort through the backlog, but they just couldn't get it done.
So, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, no, go ahead, go ahead.
No, I was going to say. So, I think it's important to kind of talk about this a little bit more. So, they're not only solving this problem, but Cherry Adams and her unit are creating the system to like make this work. So, she's setting up the structure of the unit. She's setting up the training. She's identifying people that can do all these things. Oh yeah, and then solving this really huge problem that the Army has.
Right.
So it's two things that are going on here, right?
Right, those two things, and then maintaining the morale of her own group. Because you
Right.
think of women with no formal postal operations, they're isolated. And says, all right, we got to clear through this mail, and just mountains of mail, just in airplane hangars and warehouses that were infested with whatever attacks mail, rats, bugs, and all sorts of creepy crawlers inside of the mail. And they had to not only try to sort through all this mail, and what they used were locator cards. Ideally, every time a troop moved, and I say troop because the Army is and was the executive agent for all of military mail. So the troop locator cards, and I'll put it in context of the Army. Every time a troop moved, they filled out a locator card, just not like a change of address because it's postal operations. But you think of the logistics of war, you're on the front lines and somebody says, all right, you moved here, fill out this locator card. So by the time the locator card gets back to the COMZ, the communication zone, or where the mail operations and other admin logistical support is located, the troop has moved again. So yeah, it was pretty complicated, and I just think it was because of the education of the women. They were professional women, a lot of them were, and just understanding the opportunity to serve overseas, because that's like being on an athletic team. And I don't know if you played sports, but for some schools or even professional sports, you have a traveling team, and then you have the team who sits at home, who, you're important, but you want to be on that travel team. So going overseas in World War II, it took you off it put you on the travel team, and that's the A team. So you can come back and say, hey, I was there in the middle of it, because there were three theaters of war at the time: Pacific, China, Burma, India, and then of course the European theater.
And I want to step back from this story for a second, and we have some questions that have come up, and we'll get to them from the audience. But I want to ask how you got involved with this story. When did you retire from the Army? How long ago did you retire from the Army?
Well, I retired. Oh wow, a couple of decades ago.
Okay, woo.
I should have said.
Okay.
See, that's why I
You
didn't say
gotta be
that.
careful about this.
Oh yeah. Okay. Sorry about that.
Well, woo.
Okay.
Well,
But so you've been retired. You've been a business consultant. You've done a lot of stuff. But what gets you involved with the 688, and what does it mean to you?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm a military brat, so I was born into the Army. I was born at the installation now known as Fort Liberty. My dad was with the 82nd. But I knew about wax, and so I joined in college. I joined Army ROTC. And probably about 2000, I don't know, 15 or 16, I was online. I just happened to see the story about this black woman named Edna. It was highest ranking black woman at the end of the war, one of the highest ranking women as a lieutenant colonel. And I was like, honestly, I said, this is a black woman named Edna who sometimes said things that she shouldn't have, and had a way had a way of doing things. So I really connected with the story. Her name was Charity Edna Adams. That caught my name. But then just learning more about this group of black women who I did not know existed, and then stepping back. Never saw anything about black women serving in World War II. Some nurses that a few nurses, maybe 500 or so black nurses, but nothing about black wax. So that caught my attention. And then in 2018, I'm a member of an organization called the Rocks. It's a professional development mentor organization, chapters throughout the world, military officers, senior civilians. And so it's a fundraiser for a monument. And I donated, and I remember the project manager, Carlton Philpott, he's a retired Navy commander. He worked at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, while he was in the Navy, and spearheaded the Buffalo Soldier Monument in Kansas. So that was the home of the 10th Cavalry Buffalo Soldiers, and then managed other monument projects out there. Roscoe Robinson, General Colin Powell has a bus. And so it's a beautiful park at Fort Leavenworth. So I called him and says, hey, you remember me from 1990? I bought a print from you to help raise funds for the Buffalo Soldier Monument. He says, no, what can I do for you? We talked for about an hour, and I said, I love to help, love the story about the SixTripleEight. So we started out with the monument. And while we were working to raise funds for the monument, a film producer contacted us, Jim Ferris, and I was working with another retired NCO, Master Sergeant Elizabeth Helm Frazier. So we took on the challenge of raising money for this monument for the East Coast because Carlton was in Kansas, the Midwest. So Jim says, hey, I heard about the SixTripleEight. Jim Ferris has also produced a documentary, Hello Girls, about World War I women who served overseas with General Pershing, and they put the calls through. But when they came back, the Army said they were never soldiers, and they didn't get veterans benefits until 1977. So he saw similarities, women who were unheralded. And so Liz and I helped him with the documentary. So that's how we became producers. And so Jim says, hey, Edna, for the Hello Girls, he put the women in for a Congressional Gold Medal. Why don't you do the same? I'm like, okay, how do you do that? He's like, well, here's a template. Here's a template. You got to get sponsors. And so, I drafted the legislation, and I contacted Senator Moran from Kansas because he'd attended the monument dedication. And early in 2018, he had issued a Senate resolution honoring the SixTripleEight and the monument, SixTripleEight monument. So Senator Moran is so, I guess, touched by the story because he said his father was a World War II veteran, and he says the SixTripleEight kept his parents together. So since early 2018, he was the smartest person, in my opinion, on Capitol Hill to spearhead this effort. So I contacted his office. He says, sure. And what's interesting, says, oh, by the way, don't forget, you got to get a House sponsor too. I'm like, I got to get someone from the House and Senate, because that's the way the law works. You get 2/3. And Representative Gwendolyn Moore from Wisconsin, Representative Moore went to college at Marquette with the SixTripleEight daughter, Cherie Robertson. So they were classmates. So Cherie says, I think Representative Moore would probably introduce this legislation. And so that's how we got the Congressional Gold Medal, and just sharing the story, from we allowed the women to tell their story, basically, because there were about 12 still alive then. There are only 5 alive now. But these women shared information that you will not read anywhere. It was just exciting.
So, tell us about. I mean, obviously, you talked to some of these women. What did you learn from them? What were their impressions of the unit? What do they think now? Because obviously, it's a story that
Right.
there are lots of first books by soldiers in World War II, but we haven't read a lot of these or know. So, what do they say about all this?
Well, it's interesting. What's common, all of the women said, like, it's a big deal. We just did our job. One lady, Dolores Rudock, who's deceased now, she says, I was a private and I did what the sergeants told me to do, and that was the end of it. I mean, and people want to talk about racism, like, yeah, well, that's the way we didn't give that a whole lot of time. We were too, busy working. Yeah, we know we were, there were races out there, but so was America. But our troops needed us. Our troops needed us. And then once they got overseas, they were treated so well in Europe, especially in Birmingham, England. They would get invited for tea on weekends, and they experienced a freedom, I think, that was so empowering and motivating. They were just glad to have a chance to go overseas, being welcomed and treated with, such respect and dignity away from home, and just proud to have the opportunity to serve. I mean, this is the A team. You're overseas in the middle of the war and then just traveling. I mean, in 1945, who got a chance to go to Paris and buy perfume? I mean, those are type things they talk about, the perfume, and then they formed entertainment groups and sports teams and won tournaments throughout Europe. So it was an exciting experience, and they're just proud to know that they were part and had a huge role in the Allied victory.
So we have some. We want to remind everybody that we're talking to Colonel Edna Cummings, retired U.S. Army, about the 6/888, the predominantly African American female battalion that cleared up the postal mess in 1945 in Europe. So we have a question from Nancy Nallance, and Nancy says, was there any awareness within the country, and I think this really kind of means at the time, of this unit and the nature of its work beyond the black press? Because we do know that oftentimes the black press is reporting on things, but that the white press maybe is not as interested in, or not passing on at that time. So what's the story there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In my research, I did not find a lot of information um, in mainstream newspapers, the non-black press. Now, the nation was aware because some of the historic photos we have came from the Army, the ones of Charity Adams inspecting the troops and marching in Birmingham, England. So it was an awareness. These are National Archives photos. However, the extent of the awareness, I have not seen a lot of information from newspapers, mainstream newspapers, the non-black press that contains stories about the 6/888. I'm sure there were some, but the black press, I mean, really covered these stories, especially Afro, since the publisher's daughter was in the unit. Right.
Can I ask one more, Chris?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so this is from Frank Cook. He says, can you talk about the casualties the 6/888 suffered while serving in Europe? And I'll say, in relation to that, when we lead tours and we visit the Normandy American Cemetery, we sometimes stop at the graves of 6/888 people who are there. So how did that happen?
Yeah.
What?
Well, with the 6/888 in Europe, there were 3 women who lost their lives in Rouen, France, in a vehicle accident. And there are over the 9,000 graves in Normandy. 4 are women, and 3 are from the 6/888. And they were coming back from a social function, and the vehicle overturned. I think it wasn't a Jeep, it was a Dodge, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure of the exact model. And 2 died immediately, and 1 died after. And what's interesting, what I learned, because when I went to Europe with the 6/888 tour, we spoke with the deputy superintendent, and I contacted the American Battlefield Monuments organization to ask about whether or not the Army paid for the burials. And the Army did pay for the burials of all black troops, including the 6/888, but it was a basic wartime burial, a shroud, or whatever was available. 400,000 casualties, and the Army did not put everyone in a coffin. So for the 6/888, the women, basically 2 died immediately, 1 died a few days later in a vehicle accident. They were initially buried in, I have the notes here, St. Andre Military Cemetery in July. And then the bodies were later moved with the family's consent to Normandy. But what Charity Adams did, she did not want the women to receive the basic military burial, the shroud or whatever was available, mattress cover. So she wanted the women to have a proper burial. So she took up funds within the unit and had German prisoners build coffins so the women could get a burial a little bit with a little bit more dignity than a shroud or a mattress cover or a tent. So they were buried in their uniforms. I actually, got the notes from the American Battlefield Monuments Commission. It said most um, records mentioned shroud. These women were buried in uniforms, and the families agreed to have their bodies relocated. So I know there's conversations, and I've been to events, and I originally thought that the Army did not pay for the burials, but they did. But it was a basic military burial, and that's a testament to Charity Adams' leadership. She says, these women, they will receive a proper burial.
So, Edna, when they come and they solve this huge problem, which is,
Mhm.
you critical to the Army's ability to fight, what's the reaction of the Army? Are they impressed? Do they note this? Do they say thanks? What happens here?
Yeah. Well, actually, the Army did say thank you. The WACs, the Women's Army Corps, not just, the black women. And I'll pause here for a minute. They're black women, but they were not all African American. The women were some were from Puerto Rico, the islands, and some were mixed race, biracial, who didn't know that they were black until they joined the Army. So you just had diaspora of black women. But yeah, the Army, I read the special delivery newsletter and said the best wet corps in the Army, written by a major. I've seen accolades written by or quoted, by commanders. This 688 did a great job, solved this mail problem. But the Army never gave them an award. They got their standard campaign medals, World War II victory ribbon, the the African Middle East American award, the Victory Medal. So just the three basic, but nothing until 2018. Also spearheaded by Senator Moran and Carlton Philpott, a meritorious unit commendation. That didn't come until 2019. No one put the women in for any type of awards or commendation until 2019, other than just your typical campaign medals.
You know, I want to ask a little bit about the about Charity Adams again, and you talked about her a little bit. That she was what did she major in? Math, engineering, and Latin, or
Math, Latin, and physics.
math, Latin, and physics. That's kind of unbelievable there. But she was quite a fiery personality, as I understand it, and she had a confrontation with a white general that could have ended disastrously for her.
Right. Yeah. And I have a theory about that because I've talked to some authors who wrote a book called Letters for Victory, Martha and Francis Collins. And there was a postal network, American Postal Network. I mean, you had the censors and you had the salvage of mail. So the mail, to be salvaged or that couldn't be assembled and distributed. And I believe it was the inspector general because an inspector general had gone around checking, the mail, and he had fired a white major for not handling the mail to be salvaged correctly. So this book talks about how this general was going around inspecting mail. So I'll just start with that, my theory. So a general who no one ever gives his name shows up, and Charity Adams shows him around, and he says, "Okay, I want to inspect your troops." So Charity Adams had set up, around the clock operations, 3 shifts: one shift working, one sleeping, and the other was available for inspection. So she says, "Okay, I have about a third of my unit," and he says, "No, I want to see your entire unit." And she says, "Well, I cannot interrupt my work schedule." And he says, "Well, I'll send a white officer here to show you how it's done." And so she told him, "Over my dead body." Now, first of all, this is a major. Majors do not talk to generals like that. I don't care who you are. There's some things you just don't say to generals. Oh, she said, sometimes you just say things you don't realize. It just happens so fast. And he told him, over my dead body, he says, "You'll be hearing from me." And hearing from me meant a court martial. So she knew that she probably had said something that she shouldn't have said. And she pulled her staff together, and they were going to draw up, charges against him because he had violated the Articles of War for inserting race. Had he said, "You'll be hearing from me," he probably could have court-martialed her for insubordination. But he said, "I'll send a white officer to show you how it's done." So he introduced race in the conversation, which was against the Articles of War because he didn't want to use race anywhere in your discussions, even though it was probably done within the unit, but that was just inappropriate. But few, we don't know the time frame. He dropped the charges and later came back and apologized and said, "You're a good officer." And he really respected her and says, "You taught me something." So by her standing up to him, not only did she earn his respect, she earned the respect of her troops as, "Oh, wow, this, she goes to battle for us." She also went to battle for her unit with the Red Cross. The Red Cross wanted to have separate recreational facilities, separate hotel facilities when the women would go to London. Charity Adams turned all of that around. And what's interesting, when she got out of the military, she was actually on the board of the Red Cross, and they thanked her for just being having such a significant impact into the history of the Red Cross, and as well as military history.
Yeah. So, and you touched on this a little bit already, but I'm curious since I live here in the UK. What was the reaction of people in Britain to this unit when they arrived? Because not only the African American, which is something that most people in Birmingham were unfamiliar with, but it's a large unit. I mean, it's 800 women in uniform.
Right.
What was their take on all this?
Oh, lovely. I mean, the feedback from the women who were there, the ones I talked to, and all accounts, historical accounts, it's nothing but praise for the locals because the city of Birmingham and the surrounding areas love these women. Um, and not alone they love the 688. You hear stories about how the taverns and bars welcomed black troops and actually stood up for the black troops when the military didn't. So there was, nothing but positive feedback um,
Mm-hmm.
from the women and the historical accounts about their time um, and how they were treated by the locals when they were in Birmingham or in
Yeah.
Europe in general. They had freedoms in Europe that they did not have in the U.S.
Did any of the women that you talked to comment on that? Did they, say, "Gee, this is a little odd"?
Well, I think initially it could have been some reservation, but when you're away from home and you
Mm,
receive love and you're welcome, um, they accepted the invitations and no one felt awkward. One, I think it was also Dolores Rudock who said on weekends she had a family who she would go visit on a regular
mhm.
basis. So that's consistent with everything that's written about African Americans serving in World War II in Europe, that they were welcomed by the locals.
Mm,
So I want to ask you, Edna, about the gold medal effort, and
Hmm.
and and Chris knows, and our audience knows that I was involved in a very similar effort
Hmm.
for the Ghost Army. Ours took a little bit longer. Yours, I think, took a couple of Congresses. We went through 4 Congresses.
Oh, wow.
We weren't quite as advanced as you were in the speed with which we did this. But I mean, I think that people have this idea. Uh, you would say we were trying to do this gold medal, and they were like, "Well, why won't they just say yes to it right away? Why can't it happen right away?" And it's a pretty hard thing to make happen, isn't it?
Yes, it is indeed. It's very challenging because you have to get Congress to agree.
Yeah.
Or legislation, and less than 3% of bills get signed by the president. I mean, minimum of 10,000 bills and resolutions go through Congress every year. So to get something to get with bipartisan, that means the Democrats and Republicans and the independents have to agree. um, 2/3 majority
2/3 have to sign on to the bill, right? So
before
they
it goes to vote.
before it even goes to a vote. So it's not that
Right.
you have to get 2/3 to vote yes. You have to get 2/3 of the people to put their name on it and
That's
say,
right.
I am in
Right.
favor of this bill.
Right. Exactly. And that's what we were able to do. It was a story that resonated, and I have to thank the Black press, especially Afro, because the Senator Moran did an excellent job. From Kansas, he knew the women before the gold medal and had worked to honor them, and so he really helped us, share the story throughout his, throughout the Senate. And we would call, we were grassroots, didn't form an organization or anything. We just had a lot of volunteers and organizations who wrote letters of support. So the Senate bill actually passed twice, but the House bill was challenging because I got one question: were any of these women from my district? And I could not answer that. And I found an article from the Afro that listed the first contingent of SixTripleEight women. There's about 738 names who came over with the first contingent in February, and it listed the cities. And so I took the time to crosswalk each city
Oh yeah.
with the congressional district, and some overlapped. And so when I sent that out to the volunteers and our advocates also throughout the world, because we had expats and military people stationed overseas, and writing letters and sending emails, I could answer that question, and I would say, to the House member or representative, whoever, World War II woman, Congressional Gold Medal from District 35,
Right,
Minnesota.
right.
And that got their attention. And I think that really, really helped a lot, establishing that constituency and making it personal. And when we would give presentations and show the documentary, we would invite the staffers to the documentary. But the women themselves, I think, were the biggest voice, because with the number of women who were alive at the time when we started, along with their families and supporters, I mean, they really stepped up. So to the women and the families, I mean, you all got this done, and the organizations, a lot of veterans organizations supported us: AUSA, American Legion, MOA, the Women's Memorial. I could go on and on and on. The
That's
Women's
okay.
Veterans Allowance, Foundation of Women's Warriors, the Zeta Phi Betas, sororities, because quite a few of these women in the SixTripleEight were members of African American sororities. Charity Adams was a Delta, Millie Veazey was a Zeta. We had Sigma Gamma Rho. These are the Divine Nine, the Black female sororities. And so these women were professional, college-educated women, and they were in these Greek sororities. So sororities stepped up.
So can I jump in there, Rick? Or are you gonna?
Well, I was going to do some glorying, gold medal glorying, but you can
But
go
yeah,
ahead. You
No,
can just
well,
you just
this
please
is
just cover that up and just move
Uh-huh.
on. I get it.
well, I was going to ask the question.
Yeah, it's okay.
So, all right. Speaking of all the gold medal glory here, this
Mhm.
is a question from Jim Stark, and it's one I'm sure you've gotten.
Mhm.
Pretty simply, he says, "What exactly was the unit's contribution that warranted the awarding of a gold medal?"
Oh,
So, and I'm
great
sure,
question. Right.
yeah,
Great question, because I would tell people very candidly, the gold medal is not a race-based award. It's based on doing something that's made a significant impact to the nation, culturally or institutional or individual. What the SixTripleEight did, they solved the military's male crisis. The military had a massive male crisis, and they went above and beyond where other units had tried and failed
Mhm.
since 19, because the mail started getting backlogged in 43, early 44. The worst of it was 44. And so they solved the Army's mail, or the military's mail morale crisis, and exceeded performance standards and accomplished something that no one else was able to accomplish, regardless of race or gender.
Well, and I think that maybe this is a chance for you to insert the unit's motto, right? Because
Yeah,
that has,
yes, exactly. No mail, low morale.
right,
Mhm.
yeah, and it's
And
an
again,
important job.
right, and for 2/3, for we when the bill went to vote, 422 to 0, in the House and the Senate. Like I said, it passed twice. I like to think that this is a something that brought the nation together, if only for a moment, because members of Congress just don't put their names on something if they, I mean, it's hard to get. I mean, look at all the legislation that doesn't get through that we hear about on a regular basis. And so for members of Congress to support a bipartisan that these women, we can set aside our differences and honor these women, says a lot about what they accomplished.
Let me ask you a question that people ask me all the time. Did you run into anybody who didn't want to do it, who didn't want to support it, who articulated a reason for not supporting it?
You mean legislators?
Yeah.
Oh, they don't say no. They just don't say anything.
Yeah, that's right.
They
Right.
never say no.
They just don't. They just don't
They
respond.
never say no. They never say no. Now, occasionally for members of the public, they would ask, well, who is your sponsor? Who's a house sponsor? And some members of the public would not say, well, I cannot get behind, whatever, and depending on who they didn't like. So that was common, and that
Oh,
happened.
sure, sure.
Yeah, but members within Congress, they never say no. It's well, we
I
don't
did have
think.
a meeting early on the Ghost Army when we had more Democratic co-sponsors than Republican, and a legislative aide for this Republican senator made a comment about that. He said, "Well, you got a lot of Democrats here," and that was like, okay. So from now on, I'm going to always make sure that if we have more Democrats, that I'm going after Republicans to even that list out and make
Yeah,
sure that we've got an even show there.
yeah.
Um, uh, Edna, you are not involved in the movie that Tyler Perry is making, so I'm not going to ask you. That's our friend Kevin Hemel is involved in that, so we'll
Right.
save those questions for him.
Hmm.
And I know he was also on your tour when you were taking people through Europe and sort of reenacting some of the things that the unit was involved in. But what I want to ask you about is you served in the military yourself 30 plus years after they did. And I'm sure that you, in looking at this story, found some parallels in your experience and their experience. So can you talk about what the story of the 688 means to you as an African American woman who served in the U.S. Army?
Hmm. Well, there's history and then there's heritage, because history is there for everyone to read and you learn the past and there are, lessons from the past. But heritage is a little bit deeper. Heritage is something that you connect to on a personal level. It represents your culture, and that culture can be, societal, ethnic, gender based, or whatever, your community. So that heritage resonates with you. So the 688 represents part of my heritage as a Black woman and as a woman who served in the military. I related to quite a bit of the stories, especially in the U.S., because 688 oversees 13% of the African American women or Black women who were on active duty. And just some of the things that Charity Adams talked about as an officer. There was an incident where she was, I think, on a train, and this lady, this white lady, says, "Hey, this woman is impersonating an officer." No one thought she was really an officer, or just didn't give her the professional courtesy of being in uniform. And that happened to me, 30, 40 years later, where I didn't get saluted, or I would get approached in a way. And while I'm in uniform, it says, "Oh, well, if I'd known you were an officer, I wouldn't have said anything." And that happened in the Pentagon, inside.
Mm.
So it's just when you're in a position where people don't expect for you to be, in this case, as an African American woman in uniform, the attitude. Oh, so that was one thing. Just not always receiving the respect or acknowledgement that a woman of color could be at a particular rank. So that was one thing. But then it was more of, I guess, the humility and resilience and resolve that the women had, because harsh situation, it was wartime. They focused more on the mission than they did themselves, and that's what military people do. I mean, you know it's there whether um, regardless of the environment, you know. So I think that's what I learned is just you're in a tough situation, keep your eye on what your mission is. And sometimes these incidents happen, they're painful, they're hurtful, but they can also be distractors. And once you overcome those, I mean, there's like lessons learned. There's one lady I talked to, she wasn't in 688, Millie Bailey. She was a lieutenant in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and the Women's Army Corps. She died at 104. And she was spat at while she was in uniform in Alabama. And I read that and I'm like, Miss Millie, oh my God, you know, someone spat at you. And black women in the US are being beaten, spat on, in prison for violating Jim Crow laws. And I said, how did you handle that? I mean, I'd worked through lines at the Pentagon, protesters and everything, but I'd never been spat at. I've been yelled at, but not. She says, well, I thought about the kindness. I said, well, what did you do? She says, nothing. She says, because my reaction wouldn't have solved the problem right then. She says, but I was treated with kindness more than I was with hate. So I didn't focus on the hate. And that was so powerful because, you know, I read, I'm like, oh my God, you know, and she just shook her head at me. You know, she was about 102 when we had this conversation, you know, and I was, you know, upset. I'm like, yeah, I read, and this happened to you. She says, yeah. But, you know, there were so many people who treated me well, and people are going to just treat you bad sometimes because they feel bad about themselves. So don't let them dictate your actions. I mean, of course, you have to stand up for yourselves and, you know, picking your battles. But just, you know, having the conversations with these women, and most of them, you know, said the exact same thing. No, I didn't like it, but I had a bigger mission. We had to get that mail out. Our troops needed us. We had to win the war, and we wanted to do our part. So just being grounded in that attitude was something that I, you know, could connect to.
So, I know we're just about out of time, but maybe you could mention for people who want to find out a little bit more about this unit. Are there resources or things you recommend they take a look at?
Yeah. Well, one resource, this book, One Woman's Army. It's absolutely fantastic. Written by, you know, Charity. She didn't put Edna there. She married. She married another soldier, Stanley Early, who has a brilliant story. He wasn't a Richie boy, but he did work with POWs, and he went to medical school in Switzerland after the war. So her name is Charity Edna Adams Early. So that's a great resource. The Smithsonian did a fantastic article, a couple actually, about the 688. And just go to Facebook page, 688 Congressional Gold Medal. We have one for the gold medal, one for the documentary. Instagram, 688 WW2, or just hashtag 688.
Okay.
Well, we want to thank you so much for joining us, Colonel Edna Cummings, retired colonel from the U.S. Army. We didn't even get a chance to talk about the musical. I was hoping we were going to try to sing some of the songs.
No, we weren't.
No, we're not going to.
No, we're not going to.
But we do hope for the musical. We do hope to have performances, in Europe. So that's part of the plan. We don't know when. Hopefully in 2025, and
there's a website for that too, right?
Right, 688 musical, and hopefully we'll have a gold medal minted sometime next year and presents it. So
I feel that too.
I know.
And we also didn't get to talk about the new military base, Fort Gregg Adams. That's named partly after Charity Adams. That's something else you can. You know, we're sending people off on their Google missions, but we do so appreciate your coming on to talk with us today about the 688, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Stay well. Chris, next week.
Yes.
This show was great, and we hope that Edna stays on there so we can chat with her when we get off the air. But next week, we are doing an encore episode, and we are bringing back our interview with James Gregory, who is the author of the book Unraveling the Myth of Sergeant York, and so the other 16. And so if you didn't see this show, it's very revealing, and he is very straightforward about what the kind of mess he thinks some other historians have made of this.
He's ruffled a few feathers.
Ruffled a few feathers. It's a great story. Really young guy, really worth kind of diving into. And so we're going to bring that show back next week, and looking forward to that.
Absolutely.
Please, guys, subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Stay safe, everybody. Thanks so much.